The Nintendo Switch has sold about 120 million units by its 6th birthday, but in console years that makes it a senior citizen, which begs the question of just how much further this run can go. Some people think the Switch is running on fumes given how outdated its hardware was back in 2017, let alone now, and other people think that it's got a pretty good shot at outselling the PS2's lifetime sales of 155 million units. Not many people think this, but a guy who mugged me outside of Circuit City did casually mention it before running off with my wares. Personally, I wouldn't put my money on the Switch dethroning the PS2, but I wouldn't say it's impossible either, and if you give me a minute or two, I'll explain why. Alright, so again, let me clarify that I think it's highly unlikely that the Switch will sell about 35 million more consoles before Nintendo takes it out back and put it down once and for all, but just because it's old and outdated does not mean it's impossible. I mean, with an install base this big, it's hard to imagine who's still buying new consoles whenever a big new game comes out. Like, who's looking at everything the Switch has right now and thinking, nah, this isn't for me, but then seeing SpongeBob Cosmic Shake and being like, oh, damn it, I gotta go get one of these things now. Obviously, a lot more than the 120-ish million people have bought more than one Switch, whether it be because they like the improved portability of the Switch Lite, they like collecting every model that comes out, or some dumbass kid broke or lost them somehow. I myself have the same Switch that I got at launch along with the Switch Lite because I'm a total idiot, and there was also the OLED model that a lot of people upgraded to for better picture quality. But I guess if all else fails, Nintendo could always release an upgraded model like they did with the new 3DS and Game Boy Color to keep the Switch trucking along for a little while longer. I mean, the Game Boy was only 8 years old when the Color came out, and even the Game Boy Color was only on the market for about 2 years before it was time for the Game Boy Advance. The whole purpose of the Color was just to buy a little more time for the true successor, so it's not like it's impossible for Nintendo to do the same thing with the Switch. Then again, if you're gonna release an upgraded version that's still just a Switch at its core, then you might as well just release an entirely new console. I'm just saying that if Nintendo really wanted to top the PS2 for its record its worth, glory, bragging rights, and not even a penny more in revenue, then an upgraded model under the same name would certainly help. Seems how they didn't push the original DS a little bit harder for a little bit longer to top the PS2, though, I doubt they care about an arbitrary record, but hey, maybe it's something they've regretted all these years. If that's the case, then now's kinda your time to get your revenge, Nintendo. Even if they didn't release updated hardware, though, they could still release more limited designs that collectors would probably sweep up just for the hell of it. But even though I love me some consoles with multiple colorway options, you don't want to milk your fan base too hard. Especially not in an attempt to sell a number of Switches that's even higher than what the GameCube sold in its entire lifespan. I mean, selling 35 million-ish consoles is really nothing to sneeze at for something that's already 6, which in human years is about 70 years old, so I can't stress that the odds are really against Nintendo here. But to give the Switch some credit though, it did manage to sell more units in its first 6 years than the PS2 did by the time it turned 7, so I don't know, shit, maybe it will outsell the PS2. I mean, one massive advantage the PS2 had was the ability to play DVDs, so it was a pretty damn good package deal as far as entertainment's concerned. I mean, even after the PS3 came out towards the end of 2006, the thing just wouldn't die. In fact, it wasn't even discontinued until right before the PS4 launched, and it wasn't even selling that bad. I kinda just think Sony was embarrassed to still have it out at that point. I mean, even when the PS3 was released into the wild, the PS2 had a massive library of really good games, which couldn't be played on most PS3s, meaning there was no other way to play them, not to mention the fact that the PS2 could also play PS1 games, and again, DVDs on top of that. Plus, there were also tons of PS2 games that got reprints late into the console's lifecycle since DVDs were cheap to manufacture, even back then, and not only that, but the console and games were insanely cheap during this time period too, even brand new, so it's no wonder this thing kept selling tens of millions of units even after its time in the spotlight was over. The Switch, however, doesn't have a lot of these advantages though, seeing as how it doesn't offer anything extra that's as useful as DVD support was in the 2000s, and manufacturing Switch cartridges is still more expensive than DVDs ever were, at least for games with the larger file sizes anyway. Still though, the Switch does have an assload of games you can buy digitally, many of which are cheap as hell, which the PS2 never had. Not that this is a massive deal or anything, but I mean, portability does sweeten the pot a little bit. After all, portable consoles always were more personal and less shareable than home consoles, and like, the Switch may be half home console, so having just one in a household works just fine seeing as how there's the option to play games to different users, but at the end of the day, about half the Switch's user base treats it like a portable, meaning that they'd probably cut their special somewhat if they ever tried to touch it. I, on the other hand, would never do that, of course. Not because I'm not barbaric enough or anything like that, because you better believe I am, but because I've been all alone ever since my ex-wife Chili left me over a dispute over egg bills. At any rate, though, I think portability is a much bigger advantage of the Switch than you might give it credit for, is all I'm saying. I mean, sure, there is the Steam Deck, but I don't think it's ever going to be as cheap as the Switch, especially after the Switch inevitably gets price cuts. However, I think if Nintendo were to keep regular Switch games flowing after its successor comes out, much like how the PS5 and Series X kept their predecessors alive for a few more years, then I think the OG Switch might have a shot to keep on trucking for a little while. Honestly, I kind of think this idea is where the future of gaming's headed, because if you think about it, games aren't really needed to sell new consoles anymore. For the first few years of a modern console's life cycle, it's mostly just people trying to get a hold of the new hardware just for the sake of having it, more so than needing it to play a specific game. So I mean, if you're a developer, it kind of makes sense to take advantage of the install base of the previous generation for as long as you can. I mean, it's not like it used to be where a new game console meant that games would look drastically different on the newer hardware. Don't get me wrong, they still do look better on the successor consoles, but not to the point where the games aren't even the same thing anymore. So as long as a new Switch U's in no rush to kill its dad off, then I can see there being a reason for people to keep buying the original Switch for a while. Obviously, Nintendo shouldn't do anything that hurt the newer console's momentum, but if they can manage to keep the demand up like the PS5 and Series X did for a few years, then the original Switch could easily stay strong, especially since there's so many modern games that don't even try to be graphical powerhouses or anything like that. If the majority of new releases for the immediate future are something as simple as, yeah, this game was technically made for the regular Switch, but it'll definitely run faster on the Super Switch, and it wouldn't necessarily be a total ripoff to buy an original Switch if it's cheap, especially if there's not a ton of exclusives on the newer Switch. Not only cheap, but with a library as big as it is, Nintendo could easily bundle 2 or even 3 games with the consoles. I mean, digital copies, of course, since it wouldn't really cost them anything extra, but still though, free games will make any deal more appealing. Granted, a big reason why the PS2 kept selling so well is that you couldn't play its games on most PS3 consoles, and assuming Nintendo doesn't pull a Nintendo and just do something drastically dumb for no reason, their next console is almost certainly going to be backwards compatible with original Switch games. And if the Switch 2, or whatever they call it, only really offers more power without that many exclusive games to take full advantage of it for a while, then buying the original Switch would still be viable for a lot of people, especially if we see a price cut for the games and console, which I'd imagine we would with a successor on the loose. Plus, let's not forget that way more people play video games these days than ever before, including in the 2000s. I feel like a lot of people subconsciously view the Xbox One as some kind of a disappointment just because it didn't do as well as the 360 before it, and much less the PS4 alongside it. But like, over 50 million units sold is a huge feat, especially considering the massive handicap of an important region like Japan wanting nothing to do with the brand. I mean, seriously, the Xbox One outsold the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, and it blew the original Xbox and GameCube sales out of the water that were competing with the PS2. Yet the console is still only viewed as a moderate success for some reason. I'm not trying to fabricate some idea that people view the Xbox One as a failure, but over 50 million units sold isn't considered as big of a deal as it would have been in the 2000s, and that's because gaming isn't exactly a niche activity with a stigma anymore. Just about everybody plays them these days in some form. Since Nintendo's got a deal to get Call of Duty games on their consoles, though, I'm sure the Switch's big bro isn't too off in the distant future, since I highly doubt any resources would be wasted to downgrade Duke's games, at least not anymore anyway. But assuming the Switch gets a little more time to itself with new games coming out and a price cut once it's time to pass the torch, then 35 million-ish more units just might end up happening. After going over the tale of tape, I think it's a pretty safe bet that the PS2 will retain its title, but let me know what you think in the comments, because I really do want to know. That's all for today, though, but if you got a kick out of my incoherent rambling and disturbing imagery, though, then you should check out this video I made going over every time a console's been cocky in the past. But if you'll excuse me, though, I gotta go drink some bull milk. And I'm not happy about it, but I am a growing man, so kinda have to. Later!